Throughout history, people have looked up at the sky at night. In the world, the universe felt big, unimaginable. Now, we look down at our phones and the world feels small. Do we still wonder? Do we still question the deep things about life, existence, purpose? I think we still do, just less, because phones and algorithms, objects and possessions, they are literally designed for our every comfort, to satisfy every instant desire. In the midst of all that distraction, the questions are still here. Why does this world exist? More importantly, why do I exist? And why am I here? The questions of where we came from, our meaning and our value, they're not new. Every generation through human history has had to answer these questions, most of them appealing to a supernatural being above all of this, God. Appealing to God meant that our value, our meaning, our purpose is not created or assumed, it's given and clear, inherent to every human being. But today, with every object designed for our every need, new scientific discoveries answering life's biggest questions, we're seeming to find more ways to just need less of God. The aim and direction of life is no longer God, it's pleasure. The more distracted that we are, the less we ponder and the less we wonder. Life is good, but is it? Something inside of us bubbles up and roars when the rug is ripped out from under us, when we experience a moment of pain and suffering. In those moments, questions come out, questions at God. God, where are you? Do you exist? I thought that life wasn't supposed to be this way. It's in those moments that we ponder and we wonder, no matter how distracted we are. I remember back in high school, a friend of mine shared a Facebook post of a child with a rare skin disease where his skin would constantly flake off and he was covered in open and painful sores. He couldn't sit down, he couldn't lie in bed without constantly being in pain. And the caption my friend wrote went something like this: "There is no way God can exist or be good if suffering like this exists in the world." I remember sitting back in my chair thinking, yeah, but I know that he exists. I've experienced him in my life, and I more so just felt bad for my friend. In the midst of my own questions and doubts later in life, when confronted with the reality of death, I never got to the point where I was so angry at God that I said, God, you cannot exist. But like my friend, I was disappointed. Because pain and suffering, it feels wrong. We know deep down that this is not the way things are supposed to be. So it caused me to ask questions about God's presence and God's goodness. So as we continue to investigate the question of, is Christianity true? We start here. We start with God's existence. Now, I've heard people say that the more we discover through science and reason, our need for God to be the best explanation of things we don't fully understand is shrinking. But science and reason can't explain everything. The truth is, the more that we discover through science, the more we look out at the universe and look inwards toward these smallest pieces of the human cell, the information present. We are not needing less of God. We're actually seeing that God is necessary for all of this to exist in the first place. So as we start, let's touch on some of the philosophical and rational reasons that God exists. There have been many who have landed on three major reasons articulated in logic, and we're gonna lay them out here simplistically. They are origins, design, and morality. Our first is origins, the cosmological argument. This says that everything that begins to exist needs a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore, the universe needs a cause. This is a sound argument, meaning premise 3 logically follows from premise 1 and 2. Now, this argument is a long ways off from arriving at God, but minimally, it shows that something outside of us, something outside this natural world must have been present to cause the universe. With further thought, some have expanded upon this argument. For a material world to be created, this being must be immaterial. For time to be created, this being must be timeless. It must be transcendent above all creation because it created creation. This being must be wise and smart to have designed this world in a very clear way with logic and laws to exist. This being must be very powerful. Because we are personal beings who were created, this being must also be personal, and it made the decision to create and for morality to be written on our hearts, a sense of good and evil. This being must be moral and good. Immaterial, timeless, spirit, powerful, wise, personal, and good. That sounds a lot like the biblical revelation of God. The second is the argument from design, the teleological argument. It says that the universe bears the marks of design. Objects that bear the marks of design have a designer, and therefore, the universe has a designer. Everywhere we look, from up in the sky to inwards in the human body, we see precision and balance. It's like numerous dials across the universe that are finely tuned, that if they were off just slightly, life could not exist. And finally, we have the argument I find most moving, the moral argument for God's existence. If there is no God, there is no objective morality. Premise 2, there is objective morality, evidenced by things like the problem of evil. Premise 3, therefore there is a God. Without a standard of right and wrong that we ought to obey, everyone can do what is right in their own eyes. I think relativism is unlivable. When we see evil and injustice in this world, we don't look out and say, okay, well, they're just living their truth. Let's be tolerant towards them. No, we say that is evil, and that implies a standard of right and wrong that we ought to follow outside of our individual selves and opinions. I think these three arguments give us good reason to believe that God exists, but we have to be honest. Do they actually move us emotionally? Not often. They just sit in a rational thinking part of our brains. They can easily be dismissed. I mean, think about it. How often do we wake up in the mornings contemplating the causation of things? Rarely, if ever. But these arguments do have emotional appeal. They do move us, we just have to think about it. Emotionally, the cosmological argument, the argument from our origins, causes me to sit back and say, okay, minimally, there is something else out there. There is something bigger than anything that I can comprehend, than me, than the universe. There's something huge, transcendent above it all. Meaning that we're not alone here. The argument from design. This says that I am designed, that I was created with purpose, intricately, every piece of my body working together. That means that I have value and meaning and purpose, not something that I create as I try and show my worth to others. But I am designed and I have value and purpose that is inherent to who I am. Emotionally, the moral argument is something I am confronted with on a daily basis. As I wake up and have to decide, how am I going to treat those around me? Am I going to impact this world? Am I going to make this world a better place? See, I am obligated to do good, and that standard only comes from outside of myself. But these rational arguments, unless they are deeply reflected upon, they rarely move us. They're rarely felt. They just sit in our heads. So I can sympathize with the person who says, okay, you've showed me rational evidence of God's existence, but please do not tell me about a personal God who is interacting with my life or who cares for me. Because the world that I experience here is full of pain and suffering, and it feels like God is indifferent or powerless and can do nothing to change it. Philosophical reasoning doesn't do much for the family whose child is diagnosed with terminal cancer, or for the kid who lost his mom, or for the abandoned spouse, or for the family left behind. That pain is personal. It is felt and experienced and relational. It's not a rational idea. The pain that we experience most often is expressed as objections against God through rational form. But I am convinced that behind many of these intellectual rational questions are simply emotionally hurting people. We see this as logically sound arguments for God's existence. They don't convince everyone. If the same facts and logic can be presented and two people reach totally different conclusions, then there is more motivating our beliefs or conclusions than just facts alone. These rational arguments for God's existence, they are based upon the world that we observe. We observe cause, we observe design, we observe morality, but we also observe two other things almost on a daily basis when we think about them. We observe a God who is not overwhelmingly present in our lives or felt or experienced. And we also observe enormous pain and suffering and evil in this world. These are the two biggest objections specifically to the Christian God, divine hiddenness and the problem of evil. And they get to the root of where I was questioning, the doubts that I had. God, are you present? And God, are you good? But there is another thing that we observe about humanity, and it is foundational to these concepts, and that is our ability to choose. There's something significant about humanity. We all have this sense of, first, moral obligation, that we ought to act in a certain way. Second, we have this capacity for creative brilliance. Humanity has this profound ability to create, from art to medicine, and we have the desire for deep personal relationships that are not forced, but chosen. This is all evidence of a free will to choose. We all know this. We might not reflect on it much, but we all have the ability to choose. And this is important. It's an anchoring point because free will, it enables the ability to trust and to love. Remember that as we talk about divine hiddenness and the problem of evil. Let's take a look at this picture right here and ask some questions. What mood does this convey? What feelings does it produce? The first thing I experience when staring at this is curiosity. Something was here. What was it? Why was it here? What is that wire box thing on the wall? And more importantly, what's that hole in the ground? Where might that hole lead? This room is full of empty space, liminal space. It could be the end of a story, which may not have ended well. We find distance from what was, but we don't have answers to our questions. All we have is what we observe here. And this can cause disappointment, discomfort, almost being haunted by what was. Something was here. This is kind of like the feelings of divine hiddenness, where we have discomfort, disconnection, maybe a little bit of disappointment. We have lack of clarity. Divine hiddenness is the explanation for the reality that there is a gap between us as humans and God. We don't open our blinds every day, look out in the sky and see the face of God. We don't walk around being struck by bolts of lightning. We don't hear a megaphone speaking to us at all times of the day. The concept of divine hiddenness is that from our perspective, God is not overwhelmingly present, felt, experienced, or fully known. There exists a distance between us and God. But this can seem inconsistent to verses and stories that we read about in the Bible. Listen to Psalms 139, verses 7 through 10. I can never escape from your spirit. I can never get away from your presence. If I go up to heaven, you are there. If I go down to the grave, you are there. If I ride the wings of the morning, if I dwell in the farthest oceans, even there your hand will guide me and your strength will support me. This portrays an inescapable God, but is that really our experience? This distance that we feel, I think it affects us in two ways. For those of faith, divine hiddenness is experienced in a profound sense of disappointment. As questions come up like, God, where are you? Why am I not experiencing you like other stories that I hear? Are you interested in my life? Are you even present here? For those who are non-believers, divine hiddenness is almost a confirmation that God doesn't exist. He's not felt or known, so he's not actually there. Or minimally, that God is not engaged in this world. If you've experienced any of this, you're not alone. Mother Teresa is well known all over the globe, mostly for her service to the poor in India. She founded missionaries of charity, opened homes for the dying and abandoned children, established a city of peace for those with leprosy, and much, much more. She's often seen as the shining example of Jesus's command to serve the poor, to help those in need, to give. And as I've heard stories like hers. I've often thought, man, to do that, you must have a tangible and intimate walk with the Lord. 10 years after her death, some of her journal entries were published, and one of them was shocking. She wrote, "Lord my God, who am I that you should forsake me, the child of your love, and now become is the most hated one. The one you have thrown away is unwanted, unloved. I call, I cling, I want, and there is no one to answer. No one in whom I can cling, no one, alone. The darkness is so dark." Even in one of the central moments of Christianity, Jesus' crucifixion on the cross, he cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" All this to say that it is a shared human experience that we feel distance between us and God. Like this image, we can look out at the world we observe. We can see that everything has a cause, that things look designed, that we have a moral structure that we live by, yet we sleep in this room and the maker feels distant. Now, in trying to make sense of this, some people have offered some pretty unhelpful responses. It's almost centered around a faith that's dictated by bumper sticker slogans. If God feels far away, guess who moved? This implies that you are the problem, and I find this largely unhelpful. Now, of course, when we live our lives according to our own desires, when we fill our lives with our own resources, when we don't walk with God in accordance of his design, he's gonna feel distant. But this isn't the full picture of what's going on. What if there is a reason for this distance? Why is God hidden? Here is how I have found answers to this question, answers that satisfy. It's a response that I can live with. First of all, divine hiddenness is a problem of violated expectations. From our perspective, experiencing pain and suffering, it feels wrong. Therefore, God should intervene. Yet sometimes we don't hear him, we don't see him, and we don't sense him. We're talking here about expectations in a relationship with us and God. But just for a second, could we shift our perspective to talk about relationships between us and other people? Let's say that we desire to get to know someone. Take my wife, for example. I'm interested in her, so I do everything I can to learn about her. I go to her social media, I look at her Instagram, I see pictures, I figure out where she works, I find her friends, and I talk to her friends about my wife. I find out where she studied in school. You get all of this information together, but it's just knowledge of. There's one thing missing, that is experiential knowledge. I can learn a lot about her, but I don't know her. It's like a 2D version of her on paper rather than the real 3D body soul type of experiential knowledge. Now, what is so compelling about these 3D experiential relationships? What do we long for? What do we desire? We desire love. We long for acceptance. We long to be known and to know others as they really are. Something feels wrong about just getting to know someone in a knowledge of standpoint without actually interacting and experiencing them. Real experiential relationships, they move us emotionally because they have something we long for: love and trust. To love someone and to trust someone requires choice. And choice requires a little bit of space. A helicopter parent or friend never gives the space for someone to actually love them back. Instead, they're ever present, demanding affection, demanding appreciation, demanding everyone's attention to feed themselves. But there is one thing that immense power and control cannot produce, and that is love. We see this concept of love and trust and choice and space reflected in romantic movies. What part of the movie is so impactful and moves us emotionally? When the couple is getting to know each other over a little bit of time and they have all these experiences and they find things that they like about each other. And the story rises and rises and rises until there is a conflict. Something hard happens and all of a sudden there is space. But in the end, one person chooses to say to the other, I will love you or I will trust you. The space that is given in that moment allows for free choice. In our lives, real fulfilling relationships with other people are not characterized by just learning about them on social media feeds, but doing life with them, sharing in the joys, sharing in the pain, sharing in the suffering, sharing our emotions with each other, and having that other person choose to love and trust you. If that's what's fulfilling in our relationships with other people, why should our relationship with the God who created us be any different? If God created us in his image, relationally with a will to choose, it would make sense that the relationships that we crave are ones where we choose to love and trust and we are fulfilled. The Christian faith is not about knowledge of, it is about relationship with. And that requires a little bit of space to use our free will to love and to trust. Now, someone could say to this, well, sure, we choose to love and trust others, but only because we have seen them pursuing us from the beginning. And in my relationship with God, I don't see God pursuing me. I don't see evidence of him at all. I am a non-resistant non-believer. There's a formal objection to the Christian faith articulated by some, and it makes up the argument from divine hiddenness. A version of it would go like this: if a perfectly loving God exists, non-resistant non-belief would not occur. Non-resistant non-belief does occur. Therefore, a perfectly loving God does not exist. Non-resistant non-belief characterizes a person who is not objecting to a relationship with God. That if God actually exists, they would desire a relationship with him. They just don't see any evidence and they don't see God pursuing them. Therefore, they are non-resistant in their non-belief. And the claim is that if God were perfectly loving, he would make himself known in a way that non-resistant non-belief could not occur. Now, I see a couple things here that I don't agree with, which is why I don't think this objection actually works. Non-resistant non-belief isn't provable. The idea that if I just saw enough evidence that I would respond, because we are driven by much more than just facts and logic and evidence. We are emotional beings. There's lots of studies that show that our emotions and desires, they sway us much more than we would expect. We're not driven by facts and evidence. We're also driven by emotions and desires. The Christian worldview does not share that our problem is just not having the facts or having evidence. It shares that the problem is that we love ourselves and our desires, and we fill our lives by our own resources and what we hope, what we want to get, our own pleasure, rather than choosing and trusting God. Our problem is not just evidential, it's moral. And secondly, if God is real and God is good, like the Christian story gives evidence that he is, who are we to put our expectations on the God who created us and created our minds and created logic in our thinking? Who are we to put our expectations of what divine love should look like on him? And finally, we do see great evidence. There is enormous, solid evidence in natural theology, things that we covered before, and we see evidence of God working today. Look at the evidence for miracles in things like peer-reviewed scientific journals, or evidence from visions today, people having visions of Christ. Or look in history, the historical evidence of Jesus. He lived, he died, and he rose again. That's evidence of God interacting in the world. Here's sort of a visual representation of how I picture our relationship with God in divine hiddenness. It's a visual representation of seeing the illuminated world, but not always the light. We don't see the light, it's kind of hidden out of focus, but that doesn't mean that we don't see the light it emits. We see how it lights up the room. You can almost kind of see its beams. And when we put our hand in front of this light, or we walk in front of it, we can feel the warmth of this light. We can feel its presence, even though we may not be able to make out all of the specific details. And without this light being here, we would not see any of this. Nothing would exist. There would be no warmth. There would be just darkness. There would be nothing for us to see. This is kind of like what hiddenness is like. We may not see God's face, but we see his view. We see how he lights up the world. We see his design in us. Without it, there would be no light. There would be no us. God's seeming hidden allows for us to choose, because you can't force a freely chosen relationship of love and trust. There's a story that I want to share that I find deeply moving, and it's from Soren Kierkegaard. Imagine there was a king who loved a humble maiden. She had no royal pedigree, no education, no standing in the royal court. She dressed in rags. She lived in a hovel. She lived the ragged life of a peasant. But for reasons no one could quite figure out, the king fell in love with this girl in the way kings sometimes do. Why he should love her was beyond explaining. But love her he did, and he could not stop loving her. One day there awoke in the heart of the king an anxious thought. How in the world is he going to reveal his love to this girl? How could he bridge the chasm that separated the two of them? His advisors, of course, told him that all he had to do was command her to become his queen, and it would be done. For he was a man of immense power. Every statesman feared his wrath. Every foreign power trembled before him. This poor peasant girl would have no power to resist. She would have to become the queen. But power, even unlimited power, cannot command love. The king could force her body to be present in the palace, but he could not force love to be present in her heart. He might be able to gain her obedience this way, but coerced submission is not what he wanted. He longed for intimacy of heart and oneness of spirit, and all the power in the world cannot unlock the human heart. It must be opened from within. So he met with his advisors once again, and they suggested he try to bridge the chasm by elevating her to his position. He could shower her with gifts, dress her in purple and silk, and have her crowned the queen. But if he brought her to his palace, if she saw all the wealth, pomp, and power of his greatness, then she would be overwhelmed. How would he ever know if she loved him for himself or for all that he had given her? And how could she know that he loved her and would still love her if she had remained only a humble peasant? Would she be able to summon enough confidence never to remember what the king only wished to forget? That he was the king and she had been a humble maiden. Every alternative he came up with came to nothing. There was only one way. So one day, the king arose, took off his crown, relinquished his scepter, laid aside his royal robes, and he took upon himself the life of a peasant. He dressed in rags, scratched out a living in the dirt, groveled for food, and dwelt in a hovel. He did not just take on the outward appearance of a servant, he became a servant. It was his actual life, his actual nature, his actual burden. He became as ragged as the one he loved, so that she could be his forever. It was the only way. His raggedness became the very signature of his presence. The big idea here is to kind of imagine the intention of our God in giving us the kind of revelation that he has, specifically in the incarnation of Jesus. Rather than overwhelming us with signs and wonders and a booming voice, Jesus coming down is a humble revelation of what a good God would do in order to draw us into a loving relationship with himself. Jesus coming down to earth, living a perfect life, going to a cross, dying and rising from the grave, overcoming the one thing that we cannot control, which is death, is better designed to meet our actual needs, because our need is not just to have more knowledge of God, evidence that he exists. Like I said, our need is moral. We are in rebellion against God, and the penalty for that, as Romans says, is death. So Jesus meets our deepest needs in a humble way, and that actually draws us in. This is God not manipulating, but giving evidence and allowing for free choice, our choice to love and trust him because he loves us. I find this deeply moving, that God would put the choice in our hands, that he gives us evidence, but out of love, he allows us to choose to love him back. Blaise Pascal says, there is enough light for those who desire only to see, and enough darkness for those of contrary disposition. If God were to reveal himself in more miraculous ways today, sure, it might produce more knowledge of him, move someone from atheism to theism, but would that person truly follow out of love? Or would they unwillingly submit due to power or desire for their own personal gain? In Luke 16, Jesus says, if they do not hear Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced if someone should rise from the dead. As I reflect on the reality that sometimes God feels hidden, this makes sense to me. It makes sense of the fact that I see great evidence for God, but I also see distance and hiddenness and fog and ambiguity. And I wrestle with God, why could you not be more clear? Why could I not experience your presence on a daily basis that motivates me to do good in this world? And simply because it's not just knowledge of and more revelation. It is about relationship with. In my relationships with my friends, I don't want to just know about my friends, I want to do life with my friends. Why should our relationship with our Creator be any different? The distance is necessary for me to have choice, to make my heart sing, to love, and to trust. I am drawn in by evidence. I am given a choice by hiddenness, and I am compelled to trust our good God revealed through Scripture as the Christian story best explains reality and meets the longings and desires of my heart. That's an answer that satisfies. The problem of evil is rightly so one of the top objections to the Christian faith. To the family that's standing next to the bedside of their daughter who is dying, the questions of God's existence don't arise. The questions of, why don't you intervene? Why don't you do something? Why are we experiencing this pain here? Those are the questions that arise. It's the problem raised by my friend who shared the video on Facebook. If suffering like this exists, how could God be all-powerful, or how could God be good? We are told that God is love and loves us like his children, and we are also told that God is all-powerful and can do anything. So if God truly loves us and has the power, why does he not eliminate pain and suffering from this world? This is the problem of evil. This is a shared human experience through all of history. In the Bible, we read the prophet Habakkuk cry out, "How long, O Lord, must I call for help? But you do not listen. Violence is everywhere I cry, but you do not come to save." This cry is real, and it is personal for all of us. And in the Christian church, I've heard some really unhelpful responses to this as well. Slogans like, well, God works all things together for good, or just let go and let God. While these statements may contain kernels of truth and they might be good advice, I think they are missing the question or the point altogether. Yes, God does work all things together for the good of those who love them. We see this reflected in Romans, but try saying that to a parent who is watching their child die. That pain is not rational. What they need in that moment is to be comforted. Let go and let God. Yes, we should surrender, but that's pretty hard to do when we are in the midst of hurt. These slogans are like slapping a rational answer onto emotional or relational pain. While answers may exist to the pain and the hurt, what is needed in that moment is to be comforted. Not just to say, well, start thinking a different way, but to have someone experience that pain with them, to share in their burdens, in their sorrow. It's to let someone see that they are not alone. These slogans are trying to answer a question that I don't think people are actually asking in the midst of pain. The problem of evil is expressed as a question. If God is all good and powerful, why does evil exist? It's rational, so let's answer it rationally, knowing that it might not solve the problem fully. But nonetheless, it gives us reasons to comprehend the world that we actually live in. These rational reasons help build an answer that I can live with. First of all, what is evil? Because definitions matter. We need to be clear with what we are talking about. Good and evil, they are not opposite forces. Instead, evil is a corruption of what is good. Think about it this way. What's a lie? A misrepresentation of the truth. What's cancer? When cells rapidly grow and spread uncontrollably. What's an autoimmune disease? When your immune system turns against you. And what's a cavity? When a tooth decays. Evil is the corruption of what is good. You can have truth without a lie, but you can't have a lie without truth. In the same way, you can have good without evil, but you cannot have evil without good. Now, the question that's most asked within this problem is, could God not allow evil? And the answer is sure, but that would disallow human choice. Much of the evil in this world is caused by us choosing things at the detriment of other people. And what's the value of free choice? Well, we talked about it earlier. It's love. God has created us with a free will for the purpose of love. The philosopher Alvin Plantinga sums this up so well when he says, "A world containing creatures that are significantly free is more valuable, all else being equal, than a world containing no free creatures at all." Now, God can create free creatures, but he can't cause or determine them to only do what is right. For if he does so, then they aren't significantly free after all. To create creatures capable of moral good, therefore, he must create creatures capable of moral evil. And he can't give these creatures the freedom to perform evil and at the same time prevent them from doing so. God can't make a square circle. It's a contradiction. And in the same way, God can't give us free will, but at the same time not allow us to use it wrongly. God is all powerful and all good, but for the sake of us being free beings for the purpose of love, God can't only allow us to do good. So could God have made a world where there was no suffering or evil? Sure. That just means that we would not be in it, and that would void the world of something God sees so valuable and precious, us and our relationship with Him. Much of evil is the result of choice. It's moral evil, and it's the result of us choosing. Our free will is valuable. We know this. A great illustration of this is having a robotic spouse. Let's say you come home after a long day of work and there's a button in front of you where you press it and says, press for a hug. The robot gives you a hug. Press for a kiss. The robot gives you a kiss. Does that action have any significance to it? No, because it's void of love and trust. It's void of an actual choice. It's just a programmed response. It doesn't mean anything because forced love is no love at all. Is free will really that big of a deal to us though? In the past couple years, artificial intelligence, AI, and ChatGPT have been the topic of conversation. It's all over the place. And in articles and videos, in research journals, a lot of fear is coming up. Fear of what? Fear of AI gaining free will and using its power against us. What the conversation around AI is sharing is that we as humans, we fear losing our free will, or we fear another entity gaining free will and using it against us. What also resonates with us is stories where humans break free from a script to gain free will. Think about The Truman Show, where someone steps out of a predetermined script for them and gains something that we see valuable. Human choice. And here's what's so interesting about all of this. We value free choice, we value love and trust. If Christianity is true, then God actually created us with a free will. And that makes sense that our desires, our longings, our value of it matches creation's meta-narrative. It's no surprise that we would recognize stories which see free will as valuable, something worth saving, something worth protecting or gaining when other people don't have it. It's worth fighting for, and even though it causes suffering, hardship, grief, it is worth having compared to a world where we don't have it. The rational answer that I can live with is that evil is the corruption of what is good, and it arises out of the misuse of the human will by individuals. Now, does that solve the problem? No, not at all. We can share why evil exists, but that doesn't take away the reality that it does exist. We still experience pain, we still suffer. Evil exists, and that's clear. So why does it continue? I think there's a better question to ask other than just why does evil exist? And that is, what do we do in the midst of it? We can illustrate in all sorts of clever ways why evil exists, what great philosophers and thinkers have said about the issue. But that doesn't change the reality of a parent standing by the bedside of their dying child. We can find a level of satisfaction rationally, but we will never have all of our questions answered. One of the Christian responses to evil and suffering is the book of Job. God has given us this book to, in part, answer the problem of evil. Job is poetry, it's not philosophy, it's not packed full of answers from God or proclamations. Instead, it's filled with emotion and questions. And I find this quite interesting as a book that's supposed to help us walk through evil. I mean, Job's life was upended. He was a man who trusted the Lord, who was upright in everything that he did. Yet his family was taken away from him, all his possessions. He was sick, covered in boils, suffering, wishing that he were dead. You would think in sharing an experience like that there would be answers. In the book, Job's friends try to give him answers, but they do nothing. They're calculated statements of theology that fall short. So much of Job is poetry. Poetry is not something we usually go to for answers. It's something we go to for comfort, strength, and inspiration. When Jerusalem was destroyed, God gave the Israelites the book of Lamentations. It's one extensive poem to help the nation process their grief. Could it be that God gave us the book of Job to do the same thing but on a personal level? When reading it, we feel on a greater level than we comprehend. The book reads like a therapy session, where we're not impressed by philosophical answers or amazing reasoning. Instead, we sit and we process our grief, just like Job did, with stronger faith, a humble heart, and in the end, a hand over our mouth. God graciously gives us an answer at the book of Job, but it comes in the form of a question. Where were you? God doesn't answer why bad things happen to good people, but Job's response is still this: my ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. This shows that more than the answer to the ultimate why question, God wants us to have an answer to the who question. It's not why does evil exist, but who has the answers to overcome it. Tim Keller says it well. We do not know the reason that God allows evil and suffering to continue, or why it is so random. But now at least, we know the reason it is not. It cannot be that he does not love us. It cannot be that he does not care. He is so committed to our ultimate happiness that he was willing to plunge into the depths of suffering himself. He understands us, he has been there, and he assures us that he has a plan to wipe away every tear. Someone might say, but that's only half an answer to the question, why? Yes, but it is the half we need. God may not give us a why, but he gives us a who. God gives us himself as he enters in. In the mid-1800s, Father Damien served as a priest on the island of Hawaii. During that time, leprosy was spreading, and the Hawaiian government decided to stop its spread by sending those infected to a place of exile on a peninsula on the island of Molokai. Father Damien, hearing of their needs and isolation, he stepped in to become their priest and to care for them. He became their source of consolation and encouragement as he cared for their bodies and souls without distinction of race or religion. For 12 years, Father Damien cared for those lepers, until one day he got up to share a message, possibly opening his robe to show the first signs of leprosy. And on those days, he didn't just utter, "You lepers," he said, "We lepers." In that moment, to the lepers, Father Damien went from someone who they just knew loved them to someone who was no longer on the outside looking in. Father Damien gave up everything for them. He was now a part of them. He gave up his life. There is no other true story in human history like the one where Christ steps into our suffering, not just to care for us, but to become one of us and to give up his life for us. We cry out for answers, and God gives us himself. We can ask questions why. We should ask questions why. There are satisfactory answers out there. But what we find more than why is who? God, who gave himself up for us. And what is Jesus's response to evil? Jesus redeems. In light of his model, what do we do in response to the evil we experience and see? From our pain, we can walk away cursing the darkness, being skeptics and questioning everything out of our hearts. Or we can sulk in anger, shaking our fist at God. Or we can grab a candle, we can light a match, and we can turn on the light. Evil is not a question to be answered. It is something to be overcome. To rejoice with those who rejoice, to weep with those who weep, to trust a good God and work together to redeem this broken world following his model. That is something I can get behind. These are responses and answers to divine hiddenness and the problem of evil that I can live with. I find them satisfactory, but they do not take away the pain. At the end of each of these responses, I'm given a choice to trust or to walk away. And ultimately, the answer of divine hiddenness and the problem of evil is found in the person of Jesus, the one who answers my questions and fulfills my deepest needs. Now, if you're a skeptic or a doubter who's still watching this, I'm sure that you can look at these responses, poke holes in the arguments, but I ask you the question, what is your solution to the problem of evil? Everybody has to answer the question of why is there pain? And I think the best solution, the solution that best explains reality, the world that we live in, and that gives us hope, is the solution found in Jesus Christ. There is something to be said about how strong the Christian viewpoint looks. Now, it's true, but the Christian viewpoint looks extremely strong in comparison with other responses that utterly fall short to answer our questions. The two responses intimately work together. God gives us a choice to love and to trust, because it's what we were created for. Thus, he's not overpowering to force a relationship, and he's not so disengaged that we don't see him. He enters into our suffering, into our pain, and into our world. We may not have every answer to hiddenness or evil, but evil specifically, it is not a question to be answered, it is something to be overcome. In the objection of divine hiddenness, we see God making himself known in a relational and loving way which draws us to respond. And in the midst of evil, we see a God who sees us, who knows us, who steps into our pain, understands it, and gives us hope and peace. For the sake of relationship, we are given the ability to love and to trust and to redeem this broken and hurting world. How do we respond to the hiddenness and the evil that we see?